The dust on Victoria Zimmerman's traveling dress had turned from brown to nearly black by the time she reached Montezuma, Colorado, and the September sun of 1882 was already settling behind the rocky peaks when the stagecoach deposited her on the main street with nothing but a worn leather bag and $30 sewn into her hem. She had traveled 3 weeks from St. Louis after her father's printing business collapsed under the weight of debts she never knew existed, and the relatives who might have taken her in had made it clear that a 22-year-old woman with no prospects and a father who died owing money was not welcome in their parlors. The driver barely looked at her as he tossed down her bag, and she stood there in the fading light, watching the coach disappear down the mountain road, feeling the altitude press against her lungs and the reality of her situation settle like the cold that was already creeping through the valley. Montezuma was smaller than she had imagined, a collection of wooden buildings clinging to the mountainside where silver mines had drawn men with dreams of wealth and women with dreams of serving them. The main street was rutted and muddy from recent rains, and she could hear piano music drifting from one of the saloons, along with rough laughter and the sound of boots on wooden floors. She picked up her bag and walked toward the nearest building with a painted sign that read, "Morrison's Boarding House," her back straight despite her exhaustion, because her mother had taught her that dignity was something no one could take from you even when everything else was gone. The woman who answered her knock was thin and severe, with gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her skin. She looked Victoria up and down with pale blue eyes that missed nothing, taking in the quality of the dress beneath the dust, the lack of a wedding ring, the desperate hope that Victoria tried to hide but could not quite manage. "I am looking for a room," Victoria said, keeping her voice steady. "I can pay in advance for the first week. We do not take in single women without references," Mrs. Morrison said, and started to close the door. "Please," Victoria said, putting her hand against the door frame. "I have just arrived. I have money. I need only a place to sleep while I find employment." I said no. The woman's voice was flat. "I run a respectable establishment. I will not have people saying I harbor women of questionable character. There are plenty of places in this town for your type, but mine is not one of them." The door closed with a decisive click, and Victoria stood there for a moment, feeling the insult burn through her like whiskey. She had never been spoken to that way in her life, had never been dismissed as something shameful simply for existing without a husband or father to vouch for her. But she had no time for wounded pride, so she turned and walked to the next building, and the next, working her way down the street as the darkness deepened and the cold bit harder. At each door, the story was the same with only small variations. The woman at Kelly's Inn took one look at her and said they had no rooms available, though Victoria could see through the window that half the rooms were dark and empty. The man at the Rocky Mountain Hotel said his establishment did not accept women traveling alone, and when she asked why, he simply shrugged and said it was policy. The woman at the small house with a "Rooms to Let" sign in the window opened the door only wide enough to see out, and told her she was not taking any new boarders, then closed it so quickly Victoria barely had time to step back. She tried 7 places in total, and at each one she was met with suspicion, with judgment, with doors that closed in her face. Some were more polite than others, but the message was always the same. A woman alone, without references, without connections, was assumed to be either desperate or damaged or dangerous, and no one wanted to take the risk of finding out which. By the time she reached the end of the street, her hands were shaking, and not just from the cold, and she could feel tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. But she refused to let them fall because crying would not get her a bed for the night or solve any of her problems. She stood in front of the general store, which was already closed for the night, and tried to think. She had perhaps 2 hours before the cold would become truly dangerous, and she had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The saloons were still open, and she knew that for a price she could probably find a room above one of them. But she also knew that if she walked through those doors, she would be confirming every assumption that had been made about her, and she might never escape that reputation in a town this small. She was still standing there, trying to decide between her limited options, when she heard boots on the wooden sidewalk behind her and turned to see a man approaching. He was tall, with broad shoulders under a worn canvas jacket, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly where he belonged in the world. His hat was pushed back enough that she could see dark hair and a face that was weathered but not old, maybe 25 or 26, with a jaw that needed shaving and eyes that caught the light from the nearest window and held it. He stopped when he saw her, his gaze taking in her situation with a quick assessment that seemed to miss nothing. She straightened her shoulders and met his eyes, refusing to look away, refusing to appear as lost as she felt. "You look like you could use some help," he said, and his voice was deep and quiet, with an accent that suggested he had grown up somewhere south of here, maybe Texas or Oklahoma. "I am fine, thank you," Victoria said, because accepting help from strange men in the street was another way to ruin a reputation, and she had few enough cards left to play. "You have been to every boarding house on this street," he said, and it was not a question. "And they all turned you away." She felt her face flush, embarrassed that her rejection had been witnessed, that this stranger had been watching her desperation unfold. "That is not your concern. In a town this size, everything is everyone's concern," he said, "and it is going to drop below freezing tonight. You will not make it until morning out here without shelter." I said I am fine. Her voice was sharper than she intended, edged with the fear and exhaustion she was trying to hide. He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "My name is Morgan Yates. I have a cabin about half a mile north of town at the base of St. John Creek. It is not much, but it has a stove and a door that locks from the inside, and I am offering you the use of it for the night. I will sleep in the lean-to with my horse." Victoria stared at him, trying to understand what he was offering and what he might want in return, because in her experience, men did not make offers like that without expecting something. "Why would you do that?" "Because it is the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because I have a sister about your age, and I would hope that if she were ever in a situation like this, someone would help her." She wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain her pride and her independence and prove that she could handle this herself, but the truth was that she could not handle it, and pride would not keep her from freezing, and she was out of options. "I can pay you for the room." "I do not want your money," Morgan said. "I want you to survive the night, that is all." He picked up her bag before she could protest and started walking north up the street. After a moment of hesitation, she followed, because what other choice did she have? They walked in silence through the edge of town and up a narrow trail that followed the creek. The sound of running water filled the darkness, and above them, the stars were beginning to appear in a sky so vast and clear it made her dizzy to look at it. The altitude made her breathless, and she had to work to keep up with Morgan's long strides, but he seemed to notice and slowed his pace without commenting on it. The cabin appeared suddenly around a bend in the trail, a small structure of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney and a single window that reflected the starlight. A lean-to was attached to one side, and she could see a horse shifting in the shadows, its eyes catching the light. Morgan set down her bag and unlocked the door, then stepped inside and struck a match to light a lantern that hung from a beam. The interior was simple but clean, with a narrow bed against one wall, a small stove, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves that held supplies and books. A rifle hung above the door, and there were hooks on the wall for coats and hats. It smelled of wood smoke and coffee and leather, and it was the most welcoming place Victoria had seen in weeks. "There is firewood in the box by the stove," Morgan said, setting the lantern on the table. "And coffee and beans and some dried meat in the cupboard. Help yourself to whatever you need. The water bucket is full, and there is more in the creek if you need it." "Where will you sleep?" Victoria asked, looking around the small space. "The lean-to is fine. I have slept in worse places." He moved toward the door, then paused and turned back to her. "The door locks from the inside. Use it. And if you need anything, I will be just outside." "Thank you," she said, and the words felt inadequate for what he was offering, but they were all she had. He nodded and stepped outside, closing the door quietly behind him. She stood there for a moment, listening to his footsteps fade toward the lean-to. Then she turned the lock and leaned against the door, feeling the tension drain out of her body all at once. She was safe, at least for tonight, and that was more than she had expected an hour ago. She lit the stove and made coffee with shaking hands, then sat at the table and drank it slowly, letting the heat seep into her bones. Through the small window she could see stars and darkness and nothing else, and she realized that for the first time since her father died, she was completely alone in a way that was both terrifying and strangely peaceful. No one knew where she was. No one was watching or judging or waiting for her to fail. She was just a woman in a cabin on a mountain, and tomorrow she would have to figure out what came next, but tonight she could simply breathe. She eventually climbed into the narrow bed, still wearing her dress because she had nothing else, and because taking it off felt too vulnerable even though she was alone. The blankets smelled like wood smoke and something else, something masculine and not unpleasant, and she pulled them up to her chin and closed her eyes and tried not to think about the fact that she was sleeping in a stranger's bed while that stranger slept outside in the cold because of her. Sleep came faster than she expected, dragging her down into darkness and dreams that she would not remember in the morning. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon and early light filtering through the window, and for a moment she could not remember where she was. Then memory returned in a rush, and she sat up quickly, her heart pounding. The cabin was empty, but through the window she could see smoke rising from a small fire outside, and she could hear the sound of someone moving around. She straightened her dress and tried to do something with her hair, which had come loose from its pins during the night. Then she unlocked the door and stepped outside into a morning so clear and bright it hurt her eyes. The mountains rose around her in shades of green and gray and white, and the air was so cold and clean it burned her lungs when she breathed it in. Morgan was crouched by the fire, turning bacon in a skillet, and he looked up when she emerged. "Good morning. I hope I did not wake you." "No, I was already awake," she lied, because it seemed polite. "You did not have to make breakfast." "I was making it for myself anyway," he said, standing up and wiping his hands on his pants. "There is plenty if you want some." She realized she was starving, that she had not eaten since the previous morning, and the smell of the food was making her dizzy. "Thank you. That would be very kind." He brought the skillet to the small table he had set up outside, along with tin plates and cups of coffee, and they ate in silence while the sun climbed higher and turned the peaks gold. Victoria watched him from the corner of her eye, trying to understand who he was and why he had helped her. He had the look of someone who worked outdoors, with hands that were scarred and calloused and skin that was brown from the sun. There was a quietness about him, a sense of someone who was comfortable with silence and did not need to fill it with meaningless words. "What brought you to Montezuma?" he asked finally, not looking at her but at the mountains instead. "I needed a fresh start," she said, because it was both true and vague enough to avoid painful details. "I have family back east, but they are unable to help me at the moment. I came here hoping to find work." "What kind of work?" "I can read and write and do figures. I worked in my father's printing business for years. I can set type and operate a press and manage accounts. I was hoping to find something similar here, or perhaps teaching, or anything respectable that would allow me to support myself." Morgan nodded slowly, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Montezuma is a mining town. Most of the work is in the mines or serving the miners. There is a school, but the teacher is the minister's wife, and she has held that position for years. The newspaper is run by one man who does everything himself and can barely afford to pay for paper and ink. The mine offices might need someone, but they tend to hire men. So you are saying there is no work for someone like me?" It was not a question, and she tried to keep the despair out of her voice. "I am saying it will be difficult but not impossible. You just need to find the right opportunity." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and his eyes were gray and direct and surprisingly kind. "And you need to get past the fact that this town has already decided who you are based on the fact that you arrived alone." "How do I do that?" "You prove them wrong," he said simply. "You show them that you are exactly who you say you are, and you do not give them any reason to think otherwise. It will take time, but people here are practical if nothing else. If you can make yourself useful, they will come around. And in the meantime, where do I sleep?" He was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him thinking, weighing options, making some kind of decision. "You can stay here," he said finally. "In the cabin. I will continue to sleep in the lean-to. You can help with the cooking and the chores, and I will not charge you rent, but it will give you a respectable address and time to find work without having to worry about freezing or starving." Victoria stared at him, trying to understand what he was offering and what it would cost her. "Why would you do that? You do not know me. I could be anyone." "You could be," he agreed, "but I do not think you are. I think you are someone who has had some bad luck and needs a chance to get back on your feet. And I have this cabin sitting empty most of the time anyway, so it makes sense." "People will talk," she said. "If I am living here with you, even if we are not actually living together, people will assume things." "People are already assuming things," Morgan said. "At least this way you will have a roof over your head while they do it. And if you are worried about propriety, I am gone most days from sunup to sundown. I work as a trail guide and scout for some of the mining operations in the area. You would have the cabin to yourself." She knew she should refuse, knew that accepting this offer would confirm every suspicion the townspeople had about her, but she also knew that she had no better options and that Morgan was offering her something precious and rare, which was a chance. "I will pay you back," she said. "When I find work, I will pay you for the room and the food. If it makes you feel better, then fine," he said, "but I am not keeping accounts." They finished breakfast in silence, and then Morgan showed her where everything was in the cabin, how to work the stove, where the well was for water, how to latch the door properly against the wind. He moved through the space with easy familiarity, and she realized that this was not just a cabin to him but a home, and he was sharing it with her in a way that felt both generous and slightly painful, as if he were giving away something important. "I will be back before dark," he said, settling his hat on his head and picking up his rifle. "There is a lock for the door. Use it if it makes you feel safer." "Will you be safe?" she asked, surprising herself. "Out there, I mean, the mountains seem dangerous." "They can be," he said. but I know them well enough. I have been guiding in these ranges for 4 years now. Just stay close to the cabin today until you get your bearings. The altitude takes some getting used to." He left then, striding up the trail and disappearing into the trees, and Victoria stood outside the cabin watching until he was gone, feeling both grateful and uncertain about what she had just agreed to. She spent the day exploring the immediate area around the cabin, getting to know the creek and the trees and the way the light changed as the sun moved across the sky. She cleaned the cabin thoroughly, not because it was dirty but because she needed something to do with her hands and her mind, and she found comfort in the simple domestic tasks that reminded her of a life that no longer existed. She washed her spare dress in the creek and hung it to dry in the sun, and she took inventory of the supplies in the cupboard and made a mental list of things that would need to be purchased. In the afternoon, she walked back to town, keeping her head high and her expression neutral as she passed people on the street. She could feel their eyes on her, could hear the whispers that followed in her wake, but she ignored them and went to the general store to buy coffee and flour, and a few other supplies with money from her carefully hoarded reserves. The man behind the counter was middle-aged and balding, with shrewd eyes that assessed her as she set her items on the counter. "You are new in town," he said. "Yes, I arrived yesterday, staying at Morrison's." "No, I am staying in a cabin north of town." She met his eyes steadily, daring him to comment. "Morgan Yates' cabin," he said, and it was not a question. "That is an interesting arrangement. Mr. Yates has been very kind to offer me temporary accommodation while I look for work," Victoria said, keeping her voice cool. "Do you know of anyone in town who might be hiring? For what kind of work? I can do bookkeeping, writing, teaching. I worked in a printing business for several years." The man snorted. "Not much call for that here. This is a mining town. People need laborers, not scribes." "Surely the mining offices need someone to manage their accounts and correspondence," she pressed. "They have someone, and even if they did not, they would not hire a woman." He tallied her purchases and told her the total, and she paid without arguing, because arguing would not change anything. She walked back to the cabin with her supplies, feeling the weight of them and the weight of her situation pressing down on her shoulders. She had known this would be difficult, but knowing and experiencing were different things, and she was beginning to understand just how limited her options truly were. Morgan returned as the sun was setting, emerging from the trail with his rifle slung over his shoulder and a string of fish in his hand. He looked tired but not unhappy, and he nodded to her as he approached. "I caught these in one of the high lakes," he said, holding up the fish. "Thought we could have them for dinner if you know how to cook them." "I can manage," Victoria said, taking the fish. "How was your day?" "Long but productive. I was scouting a new trail for a mining crew that wants to move equipment up to a claim near the Continental Divide. The terrain is rough, but it is possible." He leaned his rifle against the wall and sat down on the bench outside the cabin, stretching his legs out in front of him. "How was yours?" "I went into town to buy supplies," she said. "The storekeeper was very interested in where I am staying." "I imagine he was," Morgan said dryly. "This town has very little entertainment. Gossip is a primary pastime. He said there is no work for someone like me. He is probably right in the conventional sense, but that does not mean there are no opportunities. You just have to be creative." He watched her for a moment, then said, "Can you really set type and operate a printing press?" "Yes, I did it for years." "Then maybe you should start your own business. Montezuma does not have a printer. Anyone who wants something printed has to send it down to Denver or over to Leadville, which takes weeks and costs money. If you could offer that service here, you might find customers." Victoria stared at him, turning the idea over in her mind. A printing press costs money. Money I do not have. There might be one available, Morgan said slowly. There was a newspaper here a few years back, before the current one. It went out of business when the owner died. I think his widow still has the equipment in a storage shed behind her house. She might be willing to sell it, or at least let you use it in exchange for a percentage of your earnings. Why would she do that? Because right now it is just sitting there gathering dust and earning nothing. At least if you use it, she might see some return on it. He stood up and stretched. I can talk to her if you want. Her name is Martha Cooper. She is a reasonable woman and she might be willing to take a chance on you. You have done enough for me already, Victoria said. I cannot ask you to do more. You are not asking, I am offering. He looked at her with those gray eyes that seemed to see more than she wanted to show. Let me help you, Victoria. You came here for a fresh start. Let me help you get it. She wanted to say no, wanted to maintain her independence and handle this herself, but she was learning that survival sometimes meant accepting help even when pride said otherwise. All right, she said quietly. Thank you. He nodded, and something in his expression softened just a little. We will go talk to Martha tomorrow. For now, let us cook those fish before they go bad. They worked together to prepare dinner, falling into an easy rhythm that surprised her with its naturalness. He cleaned the fish while she heated the skillet, and they cooked the fillets with wild onions he had gathered on the trail. And they ate while the stars came out and the temperature dropped, and the mountains became dark shapes against a darker sky. Tell me about your sister, Victoria said, because she was curious about this man who had helped her and she wanted to understand him better. Her name is Margaret. She is 20 years old, living in San Antonio with her husband. He is a decent man, a carpenter. They have a baby on the way. He smiled just a little. She writes me letters telling me about her garden and her chickens and how she wishes I would come visit. I keep meaning to, but the work keeps me here. Do you have other family? My parents died when I was 18 and Margaret was 16. Influenza. We managed on our own for a while, but then she met Thomas and they got married, and I decided to head west and see what I could make of myself. He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. I tried mining for a while, but I am not suited for working underground. I am better with open spaces and trails and figuring out how to get from one place to another. So I became a guide, and it turns out I am good at it. You like it, the guiding. I like the mountains, he said simply. I like the challenge of finding the best route through difficult terrain. I like being useful, and I like the independence of it, the fact that I work for myself and answer to no one. That must be nice, Victoria said, and she could not keep the wistfulness out of her voice. You will have it too, Morgan said. If we can get you set up with that printing press, you will be your own boss. It will not be easy and you will have to work harder than you have ever worked in your life, but it will be yours. Why are you doing this? She asked again, because she still did not fully understand. Helping me. You do not know me. You have no reason to trust me or invest time in me. He was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire, and when he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. I told you I have a sister. What I did not tell you is that after our parents died, she went through something similar to what you are experiencing now. People in our town assumed that because she was young and pretty and suddenly without protection, she was available for certain kinds of attention. Men who had known her since she was a child suddenly saw her differently. She could not walk down the street without being propositioned or insulted. It got so bad that she was afraid to leave the house. What did you do? I made it clear that anyone who disrespected my sister would answer to me. And I followed through on that promise a few times, in ways that left no doubt about my sincerity. Eventually, people learned to leave her alone, and she was able to live her life without fear. He looked at Victoria then, and his expression was serious. I could not stand by and watch another woman be treated that way, not when I have the ability to help. So that is why I am doing this. Because it is right, and because I can. Victoria felt something shift in her chest, something warm and fragile and dangerous. This man was good in a way that she had not expected to find in this harsh place, and his goodness made her want to be worthy of it, to prove that his faith in her was justified. "I will not let you down," she said. "I know you will not," Morgan said, and he smiled at her, and she felt that warmth spread through her body like whiskey. They sat by the fire until it burned down to embers, talking about small things and large things and everything in between, and when they finally said good night and retreated to their separate sleeping spaces, Victoria lay awake for a long time, thinking about the strange turns her life had taken and wondering what would come next. The next morning, Morgan took her to meet Martha Cooper, who lived in a small house on the eastern edge of town. She was a woman in her 50s, with iron-gray hair and a brisk manner that suggested she had no patience for nonsense. She looked Victoria over with sharp eyes, then invited them both inside for coffee. "Morgan tells me you know how to operate a printing press," Martha said, getting straight to the point. "Yes, madam. I worked in my father's printing business in St. Louis for 6 years. I can set type, operate the press, mix inks, and handle all aspects of the printing process. My husband had a press, a good one, brought all the way from Chicago. It has been sitting in my shed for 3 years, and I cannot afford to maintain it or use it myself. I have been trying to sell it, but there are no buyers in this area. I would like to use it," Victoria said. "I do not have money to buy it outright, but I could pay you a percentage of my earnings until the cost is covered, and then continue to pay you a percentage as rent for as long as I use it." "What makes you think you can build a business here?" Martha asked bluntly. "This is a rough town. People here are used to doing without luxuries like printed materials. But they do need them," Victoria said. "They need business cards and letterhead and handbills for their businesses. They need wedding invitations and calling cards and notices. Right now they have to send away for all of that, which takes time and money. If I can offer those services here, quickly and affordably, I think people will use them." Martha considered this, sipping her coffee. "You will also face the problem of being a woman in business. People here are not particularly progressive in their views. I understand that, but I have no other options, so I have to try. And you are living in Morgan's cabin," Martha said, looking between them. "That has already caused talk." "Let them talk," Morgan said quietly. "Victoria needs a place to stay and I have space. What anyone else thinks about it is their problem, not ours." Martha smiled just a little. "You are a good man, Morgan Yates. Too good for this town, probably." She turned back to Victoria. "All right, I will make you a deal. You can use the press and the supplies that came with it. You will pay me 20% of your gross earnings until you have paid off the value of the equipment, which I estimate at $200. After that, you will pay me 10% as rent for as long as you use it. The equipment stays in my shed, and you will be responsible for maintaining it and replacing any parts that break. Does that sound fair?" "More than fair," Victoria said, feeling hope bloom in her chest for the first time in weeks. "Thank you, Mrs. Cooper. I will not disappoint you." "See that you do not," Martha said. "I will have the shed cleaned out by tomorrow. You can start setting up whenever you are ready." They left Martha's house with Victoria practically walking on air, and Morgan watched her with an amused expression. "You look happy." "I am happy. This is a real chance, Morgan, a real opportunity to build something of my own. It will be hard work," he warned. "Printing is physically demanding and you will be doing it alone. I do not care. I would rather work myself to exhaustion doing something meaningful than sit around being useless." She stopped and turned to face him, and on impulse she reached out and took his hand. "Thank you for everything. I do not know how I will ever repay you." His hand was warm and rough and strong around hers, and he did not pull away. "You do not need to repay me, just succeed. That will be payment enough." They stood there for a moment, hands clasped, and Victoria felt something pass between them, some recognition or understanding that went beyond words. Then Morgan gently released her hand and stepped back, and the moment passed, but the feeling of it lingered. Over the next 2 weeks, Victoria threw herself into setting up her printing business with a determination that bordered on obsession. She spent hours in Martha's shed, cleaning and oiling the press, organizing the fonts of type, mixing inks, and practicing her skills until her hands were stained black and her back ached from bending over the machine. Morgan helped when he could, using his strength to move the heavy equipment and his practical knowledge to help her solve problems. And slowly, the shed began to transform into a functioning print shop. She designed and printed business cards for herself, simple but professional, and she went door to door through Montezuma handing them out and explaining her services. Most people were skeptical, some were openly dismissive, but a few were intrigued enough to place small orders. She printed handbills for a saloon, advertising a new whiskey shipment, letterhead for the assayer's office, and calling cards for the wife of the mine superintendent, who wanted something elegant to use when making social calls in Denver. The work was hard and the hours were long, but Victoria found satisfaction in it that she had not expected. There was something deeply pleasing about taking raw materials and transforming them into something useful and beautiful, about seeing words appear on paper under her hands, about creating order from chaos. And there was satisfaction, too, in earning her own money, in being able to pay Martha her percentage and buy her own food and supplies, and know that she was surviving through her own efforts. She fell into a routine with Morgan that felt both comfortable and charged with an unspoken tension. They shared meals and conversation, and she learned about his work in the mountains, and he learned about her life in St. Louis. He told her about the trails he was mapping and the clients he was guiding, and she told him about the orders she was filling and the slow but steady acceptance she was gaining in the community. They were careful to maintain propriety, with him sleeping in the lean-to and her sleeping in the cabin, but there were moments when their hands would brush as they passed dishes at dinner, or when their eyes would meet across the fire, and Victoria would feel her heart beat faster and her breath catch in her throat. She was falling in love with him. She realized one evening in mid-October as she watched him chop wood in the fading light. She was falling in love with his quiet strength and his fundamental decency, and the way he treated her as an equal rather than a burden or an ornament. She was falling in love with the way he listened when she spoke, really listened, as if her thoughts and opinions mattered. She was falling in love with his rare smiles and the way he moved through the wilderness with confidence and grace. And she was falling in love with the life they were building together, even though they had never discussed what they were to each other or what this arrangement might become. She did not know if he felt the same way. He was always kind to her, always respectful, but he maintained a certain distance that suggested he was being careful not to take advantage of her vulnerable position. She wanted to tell him how she felt, but she was afraid of ruining what they had, afraid that her feelings were one-sided, and that declaring them would make things awkward and force her to leave the only safe place she had found. The decision was taken out of her hands on a cold evening in late October, when a man came to the cabin just after sunset. Victoria was inside preparing dinner when she heard voices outside, and she went to the window to see Morgan talking to a stranger, a large man with a thick beard and an aggressive posture. Their voices were raised, and even through the walls she could hear the anger in them. She opened the door and stepped outside, and both men turned to look at her. Morgan's expression was tight with controlled fury, and the stranger's eyes raked over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Is this her?" the stranger demanded. "The woman you have been keeping up here?" "Victoria, go back inside," Morgan said, his voice flat and hard in a way she had never heard before. "I will not," she said, moving to stand beside him. "What is this about?" "This is Ray Becker," Morgan said. "He works for the Silver Queen mine. He seems to think he has some claim on you." "I saw you in town," Ray said, his words slightly slurred. She could smell whiskey on his breath from 6 feet away. "You are the woman who prints things. Word is you are living up here with Yates playing house. That makes you a certain kind of woman, and a certain kind of woman is available to any man who can pay." Victoria felt her face flush with anger and humiliation. "Get off this property." "Not until I get what I came for," Ray said, stepping toward her. "I have money. Name your price." Morgan moved faster than Victoria would have thought possible, putting himself between her and Ray with one smooth motion. "You need to leave. Now." "Or what?" Ray challenged. "You going to fight me over some whore who is probably spreading her legs for you every night anyway?" Morgan hit him. It was a single punch, fast and brutal, that caught Ray square on the jaw and sent him stumbling backward. He recovered quickly and came back swinging, and suddenly the two men were fighting in earnest, trading blows that sounded like axes hitting wood. Victoria watched in horror, wanting to stop it but not knowing how. Morgan was holding his own, his movements economical and effective, but Ray was bigger and heavier and fueled by alcohol and anger. They grappled and struck and kicked up dust, and then Ray pulled a knife from his belt and everything changed. "Morgan!" Victoria screamed, and Morgan saw the blade and pivoted, catching Ray's wrist and twisting it until the knife fell to the ground. But Ray got in a punch with his other hand that caught Morgan on the temple, and Morgan went down hard. Victoria did not think. She ran into the cabin, grabbed the rifle from above the door, ran back outside, and fired a shot into the air. The sound was deafening in the quiet evening, echoing off the mountains, and both men froze. "Get away from him," Victoria said, pointing the rifle at Ray with shaking hands. "Get away from him, or I swear I will put the next bullet in you." Ray looked at her, assessing whether she meant it, and whatever he saw in her face convinced him. He backed away slowly, hands raised. "You are both crazy." "Leave," Morgan said, getting to his feet with one hand pressed to his bleeding temple. "And if I ever hear that you have said one word about Victoria to anyone, I will come find you and we will finish this. Do you understand me?" Ray spat blood into the dirt, glared at both of them, and then turned and stalked away into the darkness. Victoria kept the rifle trained on his retreating back until he was out of sight, and then she lowered it and turned to Morgan. "Are you all right?" "I am fine." He took the rifle from her hands and set it aside, then touched his temple and looked at the blood on his fingers. "Just a cut." "Come inside. Let me clean it." She took his arm and led him into the cabin, and he did not resist. She made him sit at the table while she heated water and found clean cloth, and then she gently cleaned the blood from his face and examined the wound. It was not deep, but it would leave a bruise. "You should not have done that," Morgan said quietly. "Which part? Threatening him with a rifle or helping you, any of it. You should have stayed inside where it was safe." "He called me a whore," Victoria said, her voice shaking with delayed reaction. "He came here thinking he could buy me." "And he attacked you. What did you expect me to do?" "I expected you to protect yourself, not me. Maybe I can do both." She finished cleaning the wound and sat down across from him, her hands still trembling. "Are you hurt anywhere else? Just bruises, nothing serious?" He caught her hands in his, stilling their trembling. "I am sorry that happened. I am sorry you had to hear those things. It is not your fault. You defended me. You always defend me." She looked down at their joined hands, at the way his fingers curled around hers, strong and warm and sure. "Why do you do that, Morgan? Why do you care so much what happens to me?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer, and when he finally spoke his voice was low and rough. "Because I love you. I have loved you since the first night when you stood in the street looking so lost and so brave, and I have been falling deeper ever since. I know I should not feel that way. I know you came here looking for independence and a fresh start, and not for some cowboy trying to complicate your life. But I cannot help it. You are smart and strong and beautiful, and you make this cabin feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep. And I want you to stay, not as someone I am helping, but as someone I am building a life with if you will have me." Victoria felt tears spill down her cheeks, hot and sudden and unstoppable. "I thought you were just being kind. I thought you saw me as an obligation, someone you were helping out of duty." "No," Morgan said fiercely. "Never that. You are not an obligation. You are the best thing that has happened to me in years, and I was afraid to tell you because I did not want to pressure you or make you feel like you owed me something. But after tonight, after almost losing you, I cannot keep pretending that I do not feel what I feel." She stood up and moved around the table to him, and he rose to meet her, and when their lips met it was like coming home after a long journey. The kiss was tender and desperate and full of all the longing they had been holding back, and when they finally pulled apart they were both breathing hard. "I love you too," Victoria whispered against his mouth. "I have been so afraid to tell you. I have been so afraid of everything, but I am not afraid of this. I am not afraid of you." He kissed her again, deeper this time, and his hands came up to cup her face with a gentleness that made her heart ache. "Stay with me," he said. "Not as my tenant or my friend, but as my partner, as my wife if you will marry me. I know it is fast. I know we have not known each other long, but I am sure about this. I am sure about you." "Yes," Victoria said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you. I want nothing more than to build a life with you." They held each other for a long time, swaying slightly in the lamplight, and outside the darkness was complete, and the stars were bright, and the mountains stood silent witness to their promise. When they finally pulled apart, Morgan insisted on sleeping in the lean-to as usual, because he was determined to maintain propriety until they were properly married. And Victoria did not argue because she loved him more for his respect and his honor. They were married 2 weeks later by the minister in Montezuma, with Martha Cooper and the storekeeper's wife as witnesses. Victoria wore her best dress, cleaned and mended, and Morgan wore a new shirt that he bought specially for the occasion. And when they exchanged vows, they meant every word with a depth of feeling that left no room for doubt. The townspeople were surprised by the marriage, but gradually they came to accept it, especially as Victoria's printing business continued to grow and prove its value to the community. She was no longer the suspicious stranger who had arrived alone and desperate, but Mrs. Yates, the printer, a respectable businesswoman with a hard-working husband and a growing reputation for quality work. The years that followed were not always easy, but they were good. Morgan continued his work as a guide, and Victoria built her printing business into a successful operation that served not just Montezuma, but several surrounding mining camps. They worked hard and saved their money, and eventually they were able to buy the cabin and the land around it from the mining company that owned it, making it truly theirs. Their first child was born in the spring of 1884, a boy they named Samuel after Morgan's father. He was a healthy baby with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair, and he brought a joy into their lives that they had not known was possible. Victoria continued to work at the print shop, bringing Samuel with her and setting up a cradle near her workspace, and Morgan adjusted his guiding schedule so that he was never gone for more than a few days at a time. 2 years later, they had a daughter, whom they named Clara after Victoria's mother. She was a delicate child with a fierce spirit, and she grew up playing in the print shop and learning to set type almost before she could read. She had her mother's intelligence and her father's quiet strength, and Victoria often thought that she was the perfect combination of both of them. Life in Montezuma was never easy, with long winters and short growing seasons and the constant boom and bust cycles of the mining industry. But the Yates family thrived through hard work and love, and the kind of partnership that made challenges feel surmountable. Victoria's printing business became an institution in the town, and Morgan's reputation as a guide made him sought after throughout the region. They built a good life together, one founded on mutual respect and genuine affection, and they never forgot the circumstances that had brought them together. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the fire was burning low, Victoria and Morgan would sit together on the porch of their cabin and look out at the mountains, and Victoria would remember the desperate woman she had been on that first night, standing in the street with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. She would remember the doors that had closed in her face and the one door that had opened and stayed open, welcoming her in and giving her not just shelter but a home. "You ever regret it?" she asked Morgan one evening, her hand in his. "Taking me in that first night?" "Never," he said without hesitation. "You are the best decision I ever made. I was a stranger. I could have been anyone. But you were not just anyone. You were you." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "And you were exactly who I had been waiting for, even though I did not know it until I saw you standing there in the street." They watched the sun set behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple, and Victoria thought about how strange and wonderful life was, how a single moment of kindness could change everything, how a door that stayed open could lead to a love that would last a lifetime. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges that the Yates family met together. The silver market crashed in 1893, and Montezuma's population declined as miners left to seek opportunities elsewhere. But Victoria's printing business adapted, taking on mail-order work from other towns and expanding her services to include bookbinding and specialty printing. Morgan shifted his focus from mine-related guiding to leading hunting and fishing expeditions for wealthy tourists from Denver and beyond, taking advantage of the growing interest in the Colorado mountains as a recreational destination. Samuel grew into a thoughtful young man who shared his father's love of the wilderness and his mother's intellectual curiosity. He attended school in Montezuma through the 8th grade, then continued his education through correspondence courses that Victoria helped him manage, and eventually he went to Denver to study surveying and engineering. Clara was more interested in the creative aspects of the printing business, and she showed a talent for design and typography that exceeded even her mother's skills. By the time she was 16, she was designing advertisements and book covers that attracted clients from across the state. In 1895, when Victoria was 35 and Morgan was 38, they had another child, a daughter they named Margaret after Morgan's sister. She was a surprise and a blessing, born healthy and strong despite Victoria's concerns about having a child at her age. Little Margaret was sweet-tempered and curious, and she brought a renewed sense of joy and energy to the household. Morgan's sister, the original Margaret, had remained close despite the distance, writing regularly and visiting when she could. Her own family had grown to include 4 children, and the cousins exchanged letters and photographs and maintained connections, despite living hundreds of miles apart. When Margaret's husband Thomas died in an accident in 1897, leaving her with 4 children to raise alone, Morgan and Victoria invited her to bring the family to Montezuma. Margaret declined, preferring to stay in San Antonio where she had community and support. But the offer itself strengthened the bond between the siblings and reinforced the value of family that both Morgan and Victoria held dear. The turn of the century brought modernization to the mountains. Telephone lines reached Montezuma in 1901, and electricity arrived in 1903, transforming daily life in ways both large and small. Victoria was able to light her print shop with electric bulbs instead of gas lamps, making it possible to work longer hours with less eye strain. Morgan installed electric lights in the cabin, and the family marveled at the convenience of having illumination at the flip of a switch. Samuel returned from Denver in 1902 with a degree in civil engineering and a wife named Ellen, a bright young woman from a ranching family near Colorado Springs. They settled in Montezuma, where Samuel used his engineering skills to work on improving the roads and infrastructure in the mining district, and Ellen helped Victoria in the print shop while raising their own growing family. They gave Victoria and Morgan their first grandchild, a boy named Morgan after his grandfather, in 1903. And the arrival of the baby brought tears to Morgan's eyes in a way that surprised and touched Victoria. Clara, meanwhile, had developed a reputation as one of the finest commercial artists in Colorado. At 21, she was dividing her time between Montezuma and Denver, maintaining a studio in the city where she took on advertising work for major businesses, while still contributing to the family printing operation. She was courted by several young men, but she was in no hurry to marry, preferring to establish her career first. And Victoria supported her independence, even when some in town questioned whether a young woman should be traveling alone and living independently. Young Margaret grew up surrounded by family and creativity, learning to read at her mother's knee and to set type before she started school. She was particularly close to her father, and Morgan would take her with him on easier guide trips, teaching her to read trails and weather and the mountain itself. She had his calm temperament and his way of seeing the essential truth of things, and Victoria often thought that of all their children, Margaret might be the one most like both of them in equal measure. The years had been kind to Victoria and Morgan physically as well as emotionally. Hard work and mountain air kept them strong, though Morgan now carried reading glasses in his pocket for close work, and Victoria had developed a habit of rubbing her hands when the weather turned cold, easing the ache that came from years of operating the printing press. They were still deeply in love, still partners in every sense of the word, and the passion that had brought them together had matured into something even more valuable, a steady warmth that sustained them through all of life's variations. In the summer of 1905, Martha Cooper passed away at the age of 78, leaving the print shop building to Victoria in her will. Martha had never remarried after her husband's death, and she had come to view Victoria as something like a daughter. Proud of what the younger woman had built from the opportunity Martha had provided all those years ago. At Martha's funeral, Victoria spoke about how a single act of faith, a willingness to take a chance on a desperate stranger, had changed the course of her life. She spoke about how kindness rippled outward in ways we could never fully measure, and how Martha's generosity had not only saved Victoria, but had created a business that now supported multiple families and served an entire region. The inheritance of the building allowed Victoria to expand the printing operation significantly. She added new equipment, hired 2 full-time employees, and began taking on larger commercial contracts. The business that had started as a desperate gamble had become one of the most successful enterprises in Montezuma, and Victoria took pride in knowing that she had built it through her own skill and determination, even though she never forgot that it had only been possible because people had given her chances when she needed them most. On the 20th anniversary of their first meeting, in September of 1902, Morgan took Victoria back to the spot where he had first seen her, standing in front of the closed general store with nowhere to go. The store was under different ownership now, and the street had been improved with proper drainage and boardwalks, but the basic geography was the same. "You remember what you were thinking that night?" Morgan asked, his arm around her waist. "I was thinking that I had made a terrible mistake coming here," Victoria said. "I was thinking that I was going to die on this mountain, alone and forgotten, and that no one would even know or care. And now I know that the worst night of my life led to the best years of my life." She turned to face him, reaching up to touch his face, which was weathered now but still handsome, still dear. "You saved me, Morgan, not just that night but every day since. You gave me a place to stand, and from that place I was able to build everything else." "We built it together," he corrected gently. "I gave you a door to walk through, but you are the one who decided what to do once you were inside. You are the one who turned desperation into determination, who built a business from nothing, who raised 3 extraordinary children and created a life worth living. I am proud to be your husband, Victoria. I am proud of everything you are." She kissed him there on the street, not caring who might see, and he kissed her back with the same passion and tenderness he had shown on their first kiss 20 years earlier. Some things changed with time, but the fundamental truth of their love was not one of them. The years continued their steady march. Samuel and Ellen had 4 children by 1910, and the family home that Victoria and Morgan had built was filled with grandchildren on holidays and weekends. Clara finally married in 1908, choosing a photographer from Denver named James, who shared her artistic sensibility and her entrepreneurial spirit. They started a combined design and photography studio that quickly became one of the most sought-after creative firms in Colorado, and they divided their time between Denver and extended visits to Montezuma that filled the cabin with laughter and long conversations about art and business and life. Young Margaret, who turned 15 in 1910, showed every sign of following in her father's footsteps as a wilderness guide. She was more comfortable on a mountain trail than in a drawing room, and she had a natural gift for navigation and outdoor survival that Morgan nurtured with pride. Victoria worried sometimes about her youngest daughter's unconventional path, but Morgan reminded her that they of all people should understand that conventional paths were not always the right ones, and that Margaret had the same right to choose her own way that they had claimed for themselves. In 1912, Morgan was offered a position as the head guide for a new tourist operation that planned to build a lodge and offer excursions throughout the San Juan Mountains. It was a prestigious offer with a good salary, but it would have required him to be away from home for extended periods during the busy summer season. He considered it carefully, discussed it with Victoria, and ultimately turned it down. At 55, he was less interested in prestige and money than in time with his family and the freedom to choose his own clients and set his own schedule. Victoria supported his decision completely, understanding that they had reached a stage of life where quality mattered more than quantity, and where the wealth they valued most was measured in relationships rather than currency. Victoria herself began to gradually step back from the day-to-day operations of the print shop, training the employees she had hired and giving more responsibility to Clara during her visits. At 52, Victoria found that she had less patience for the physical demands of operating the press, and she was more interested in the creative and strategic aspects of the business. She took on special projects, designed custom pieces for important clients, and served as a mentor to young women in the region who were interested in business and independence. The First World War brought changes and sorrows to Montezuma as it did to communities across the nation. Samuel, though too old for the draft, volunteered for engineering work with the army and spent 18 months in France helping build roads and bridges. His absence was difficult for the family, and Victoria spent many nights unable to sleep, praying for his safe return. When he finally came home in 1919, thinner and quieter but physically unharmed, the family gathered for a celebration that lasted 3 days. Clara and James used their creative skills to design posters and materials for the war effort, and Margaret, who was 24 when the war ended, had spent the duration working as a wilderness survival instructor at a training camp in Montana, teaching soldiers skills they would need in the mountain campaigns. Victoria was proud of how all 3 of her children had contributed according to their abilities, and she was grateful beyond measure that all of them had survived. In the early 1920s, as Victoria and Morgan entered their 60s, they began to think seriously about the legacy they would leave. The print shop was secure, with competent employees and a steady client base. Samuel's engineering firm was thriving, Clara's design studio was nationally recognized, and Margaret had established herself as one of the most skilled wilderness guides in Colorado, male or female. The grandchildren were growing up strong and educated, with opportunities that Victoria and Morgan had never imagined in their own youth. One evening in 1923, sitting on the porch of the cabin that had been their home for 41 years, Victoria said, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not helped me that night? If you had just walked past and minded your own business?" "No," Morgan said simply. "Because I could not have done that. It was not in me to walk past someone who needed help. But you gave me so much more than help. You gave me a life. We gave each other a life," he corrected. "You think I was complete before you came along. I was just existing, Victoria. Working and surviving and not really living. You gave me purpose and partnership and love. You gave me children and grandchildren and a reason to build something lasting. We saved each other." "I suppose we did," Victoria said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "And I would do it all again exactly the same way. Every difficult moment, every closed door and cruel word, all of it," she confirmed, "because it led me here to you to this." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind the peaks they knew so well. The mountains were eternal, and the love they had built was as enduring as stone, as constant as the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Morgan died in his sleep in the winter of 1928, 2 months after his 71st birthday. He had been out guiding a group of hunters through the mountains, had come home tired but happy, and had simply not woken up the next morning. Victoria found him peaceful in their bed, and though her grief was profound, she was grateful that he had died as he had lived, on his own terms and surrounded by the mountains he loved. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half the state. People came from mining camps and ranches and cities, people whose lives Morgan had touched through his kindness and his skill and his fundamental decency. Samuel and Clara and Margaret stood with their mother as the minister spoke, and Victoria held her head high and did not cry, because Morgan would have wanted her to be strong. But later, alone in the cabin that suddenly felt impossibly empty, she allowed herself to weep for the man who had changed her life with a simple act of compassion, who had loved her completely and without reservation, who had been her partner and her best friend for 46 years. She mourned him deeply and honestly, and she allowed herself the time she needed to grieve. But she did not give up or give in to despair, because that would have dishonored everything they had built together. Instead, she continued to work at the print shop, continued to be involved with her children and grandchildren, continued to live a full and purposeful life, even though part of her heart would always belong to the man she had lost. She lived another 12 years, dying in her sleep in 1940 at the age of 80. In those final years, she often told the story of how she had arrived in Montezuma with nothing, how every door had closed in her face, and how one man had opened his door and never closed it. She told the story to her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and she told it to young women who came to her seeking advice about business or life or love. "Kindness matters," she would say, "and taking chances on people matters. Morgan took a chance on me when no one else would, and that single act of faith changed both our lives. Remember that when you see someone who needs help. Remember that your kindness might be the thing that saves them. And remember that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst moments, if you are brave enough to keep going." She was buried next to Morgan in the Montezuma Cemetery, on a hillside overlooking the valley where they had spent their lives. The headstone was simple granite, with both their names and the dates of their births and deaths, and beneath that a single line that Samuel had chosen. They opened their door to each other and never closed it. The printing business continued for another generation under Clara's management, and the cabin remained in the family, used by various descendants as a vacation home, and eventually preserved as a historical site. The story of Victoria and Morgan became part of the local history, told and retold until it took on the quality of legend, and new generations learned about the woman who had been refused service at every door and the cowboy who had opened his door and changed her life. But for those who had known them, the story was not a legend but a truth, a reminder that love could be found in the most unexpected places, that kindness was never wasted, and that two people who chose each other could build something that would outlast them both. They had started with nothing but hope and determination, and they had created a legacy of love and work and family that would endure for generations. And it had all begun on a cold September night in 1882, when a desperate woman stood alone on a mountain street, and a kind man offered her shelter, and neither of them knew that they had just found the person they had been searching for all their lives.